Welcome to Divcasts from University of Chicago Divinity School. For more of our podcasts and information about our terms of use, please see our website, divinity.uchicago.edu/podcasts.
We're going to get started with our faculty panel in just a second. I wanted to make an announcement. Hannah, who is here and is an area assistant in the Divinity School, she's also works with Greening the Divinity School, which is a student club, one of many in the Divinity School, has asked, and I think this is an amazing idea, just to make sure that when you go to dispose of your things, that you see that there's both a trash can and a recycling bin. And especially the paperboard cartons can go into the recycling bin. So if you take the things that are non-recyclable into the trash, but the paperboard box and cans and bottles into the recycling bin. So we like to be responsible stewards of our world. The order of the day for lunch is a faculty panel. My goal for the faculty panel was both to try to give a sense of the ways in which, this is going to sound fanciful, but the ways in which knowledge is organized in this school, particularly by areas of study, and also to think about the ways in which the faculty's work traverses those boundaries or those disciplines and moves amongst them with the various things that they do. So we have a dean's panel. For those of you who have not yet met her, I would like to introduce Dean Margaret M. Mitchell, who is the Dean and Shaler Matthews Professor of New Testament and Early Christian Literature. I'm going to let her, she's going to convene and preside the panel and introduce the rest of the folks who are here who you should meet.
I have my fancy name tag on now. I actually found it by excavating on my desk, so that was... I just want to make a few introductions of some people who are seated here just so you can be sure to know whom you're with. This is a busy time on a Thursday in Swift Hall, and so the faculty are all over the building and are teaching and are doing various things, but I want to be sure you meet those who are here, and also members, some other crucial members of the Divinity School administrative staff and dignitaries. So as I was looking over there, I saw Professor Hammerschlag was sitting over there, but now she's here, and I will introduce you in a minute. But next to the absent Sarah Hammerschlag is Ann Knaffel. Ann Knaffel, give a big Hollywood wave. Ann is the bibliographer for religion and philosophy in Regenstein Library. She's an a double alumna of the Divinity School, MA and PhD in Hebrew Bible. And then moving around here, Professor Richard Miller in religious ethics, focusing in particular on social and political ethics. Definitely someone whom you should meet. And then coming around here, you have met, of course, Dean Owens earlier this morning. And you should meet Assistant Dean of Students in the Divinity School, Margaret Sanford Norbeck, who handles registration, coveted stipend checks, and other things. So she's someone good to know as well. And at this table, Professor Karen Krause, who is Assistant Professor of Byzantine Theology and Visual Culture, teaching 2 courses this quarter, and is one of them on the schedule, so you have a chance. And Professor Richard Rosengarten, whom you met earlier today, Associate Professor of Religion and Literature and Director of MA Studies. And among other dignitaries, you really should meet the Dean of Student, the DSA President, Sarah Jo Swiatek, who is PhD student in religious ethics and alumna of the Divinity School's MA program, and an amazing leader of our student group, indeed a decorated leader of our student group. So, and then other students who are present, you want to stand and say hi? Who are you? Did I get you with your mouth full? That wasn't intentional, sorry.
I'll be on the second year, and I'll be on the first panel at 1:30.
Great.
I'm Alex. I'm a secondary student. I study this part-time with the
Great, thanks, Alex.
I'm Hannah Campbell Gustafson. I'm a 4th year MDiv and English with the social work school.
Good.
I'm Jamie. I'm a 2nd year MA Hinduism.
Great, thank you.
Hi, I'm Jen. I'm a 3rd year
So DSA officers abounding. And Emily was over there, I think, wasn't she? But did she go to class or something? Is everyone present and accounted for? Okay. So, faculty panel. Four of my cherished and distinguished faculty colleagues who represent different areas and different committees of the Divinity School. Starting from my far right, Dwight Hopkins is professor of theology in the Divinity School. Next to him is Dan Arnold, associate professor of the philosophy of religions in the Divinity School and affiliated faculty in the Department of South Asian Languages and Civilizations here in the Division of the Humanities. Next to him is Jeffrey Stackert, assistant professor of Hebrew Bible, who is also strongly associated with the program on the Bible in the Ancient Near East in the Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations Department, and also affiliated status in the program on the Ancient Mediterranean World in the Department of Classics in the Humanities Division. And Professor Sarah Hammerschlag, assistant professor of religion and literature in the Divinity School. So here are some of the prompts for the panelists, and I'm going to ask, starting with Professor Hopkins, ask you to speak to some or all of these questions. How do you situate yourself within the academic study of religion? How do you make sense of your affiliation with a particular area of study in the Divinity School, that is, among the 11 areas of study? And how would you characterize the breadth of inquiry within that area? And third, where in your teaching and research do you experience dynamic interaction amongst the categories of areas, degree programs, disciplines that compose the school and that compose the full university of which we are a part? So these areas are not departments, and the Divinity School itself is not a segmented entity. So we want to hear the colleagues talk about their intellectual citizenship and engagements across campus. So Professor Hopkins, please. Great.
I'm interested in the academic study of religion as it pertains to building healthy community and healthy individuals within community. I choose the discipline of constructive theology because it allows me to make normative claims about this interest. Constructive theology, especially drawing on Christian sources, is one attempt to bring coherence and intention to how communities make meaning out of their lives. For example, the word theology suggests a relationship between theos, God, and logos, humanity. Because of the very ambiguity of the theos, we humans are the ones who think about, talk about, dream about, and experience what we see as a theos. In this sense, the more we study the human communities who imagine the theos, and also the practices of the theos, the more we can have a better appreciation for the theos. In this sense, the more we study the human communities who imagine this theos, the more we can understand theology. That is to say, the relationship between theos and logos. The humans imagine and interpret the theos. Put another way, humans do theology, not God. Therefore, who are these humans? What is their social context? What culture glues them together? What are the power relationships among them? What are the intergenerational values passed down between families? In this sense, theology, for me, is an exciting and rich well of interdisciplinary potentialities. Thus, the key conversational partners for exploring the theos-logos dynamic are politics, culture, economics, and history. Now, at the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century, theology is further conditioned by the intimate global interaction between and among countries. Technologies, wealth transactions, and cultural arrangements, among other things, have made us all neighbors on our home, which is planet Earth, and increasingly on the moon and other planets. Whether we call this phenomenon globalization, transnationalism, glocalization, a multipolar planet, a clash of world civilizations, or interplanetary exploration, theology has to take into account the realities of this time. Furthermore, if we follow the logic of the Christian story, the central act of that narrative is Jesus' incarnation among people who choose him as their ultimate way in their concrete lives. In this narrative, there never was and never can be any separation of the theos and the logos. For me, Christianity is thoroughly incarnational, totally embedded in the human realm. The Jesus figure, the main actor in the drama and the denouement, was in the beginning of the linking of the spiritual with the material. And the Jesus figure of that narrative remains inextricably ensconced in the material reality in his historical life and after the history of his death. The Logos-Theos connection can never be separated in the logic of the Christian dreaming. Now, what does this mean for theology? Theology, therefore, is the study of the materiality of human communities as they encounter their memory, imagination, and hope for an ultimate healthy life. Because theology develops as an interpretive enterprise about what humans think about their ultimate beliefs, then doing theology at the University of Chicago, in my estimation, is the best place to develop human theologies. The Divinity School offers a treasure trove of academic resources. Theology is open to and seeks collaboration with all of the 11 areas of the three communities structure. These disparate bodies of knowledge and claims to variegated epistemologies challenge Christian theology to be more exact in the logic and the accounting of its object of study, that is to say, the unbreakable tie between theos and logos. So too, being situated in a university context challenges theology to be more scholarly adept in its claims. What does theology have to say to the business school, the departments focusing on political science, physics, neurobiology, psychology, and the world's other great religions? What about the School of Public Policy? One way to think about theology is to perceive it as in and of itself. In this regard, one seems to try to first somehow get clear about theology, Jesus, the church, and Christianity separated from reality. Another way, I move in this direction, is to interpret theology as already always part of all overall life. The University of Chicago, and the university in general, is an amazing experiment of creating new knowledge, rejuvenating traditions and languages, all so that human life might be more rich. Actually, if one assumes this scholarly posture for theology, one is in line with the explicated stated goal of the university. That is to say, theology is about what it means to be human. Theology is about theological anthropology. Thank you.
Professor Dan Arnold, speaking ex cathedra.
I'm comfortable. So I'm in the philosophy of religions area. One of the ways I typically introduce that area is by bringing it into relief against an ideal, typical methodological other, by thinking about how different approaches in religious studies might relate to or interrogate any claim or belief issuing from a religious tradition. And so the sort of ideal, typical methodological other for me might be a historical or sociological or socio-critical approach, which would ask of any belief or claim of a religious tradition what the social and material conditions are for its continued circulation, who benefits from it, what kinds of social formations it tends to underwrite, what kinds of implications it has for other historical developments in the region. Whereas I'm inclined to approach any belief or claim issuing from a religious tradition by asking, is it true? What are the reasons for thinking this is a possibly true and interesting claim? And I don't have to talk about that idea very long before I get to saying that turns out to be a highly complicated question, raising all kinds of questions about what it would mean for any claim to be true and how or whether we could know it's true. So I typically hasten to add that even though I take that kind of question as my guiding question, answers to it are seldom forthcoming. But I do take seriously the possibility of religious claims and of philosophical reflection on them as saying possibly true and interesting things that matter for us. In my capacity as a philosopher of religion, I have a lot of colleagues in the philosophy of religion program who focus on Western philosophical and theological traditions. So I have really great conversations with Kevin Hector, who's appointed in PR but also in theology, and in Ryan Coyne, who focuses on German idealism, but especially in conversation with early Christian thought, and with Arnold Davidson, who has been teaching seminars for years on Foucault and the idea of spiritual practices, and people like that. But I bring my methodological approach to bear principally on Indian Buddhist material. So I'm also a scholar of Indian Buddhist philosophy. And what it means that I do that in the PR area is that I try to study Indian Buddhist thinkers in something like the same way that people in philosophy departments still study Kant or Aristotle. So not just as interesting moments in the history of ideas, but as viable interlocutors in conversations about things that we're still unclear about, still that are still are at stake. But that I do this with respect to Buddhist philosophy also means that I have a whole other set of conversation partners among Indologists and among scholars of Buddhist studies. So I also count among my conversation partners people from other areas in the Divinity School. Christian Wedemeyer in the History of Religions, Matthew Kapstein, jointly appointed in Philosophy of Religions and in History of Religions, Brooke Ziporin, who's jointly appointed in Philosophy of Religions and who has a lot of similarities to me in terms of approach, but who works on Chinese Buddhism, about which I know nothing. Paul Kopp in the Department of East Asian Languages and Civilizations also works on Chinese Buddhism. Stephen Collins in the Department of South Asian Languages and Civilizations, who is jointly appointed in the History of Religions program here. So I can think about myself in terms of my characteristic disciplinary approach and identify a whole set of interesting conversations and conversation partners that follow from that. And I have done things under that description, like co-teach with Ryan Coyne a seminar on the philosophical category of intentionality, or teach with Kevin Hector, it wasn't actually a class, a sort of informal seminar on the philosophy of John McDowell. But then I also teach a term of advanced Sanskrit every year and have a whole set of conversations among people who work on things like Stephen Collins does, like gender in 20th century Thai Buddhism. So my own situation here and the various ways of identifying it, both in terms of area of study and in terms of discipline, is typical of the ways that religious studies in general, and perhaps especially religious studies here at the University of Chicago in the Divinity School, constitutively cuts across lots of different areas. And I count all of these conversations and conversation partners as really equally valuable and equally important to what I do, and as equally conversations that I try to bring students into. That's all I have to say.
Professor Jeffrey Stackert.
So I am a scholar of the Hebrew Bible and ancient Near Eastern religion and culture. and I'm situated here in the Divinity School in the Bible area. The Bible area covers the Hebrew Bible, early interpretation in early Judaism, also early Christianity, the formation of the Christian canon, and then early Christian interpretation and early Christianity in its formation. So we cover a lot of space, a lot of time, a fair bit of geography in our area. And we, unlike a lot of programs elsewhere, try to keep the conversation together between Hebrew Bible and ancient Near Eastern studies and early Judaism, early Christianity, and its interpretation. And what this means is that there's a really dynamic set of conversations that happen within our area, both among the faculty, but then also especially among the students, because we have students who really try to make unique combinations that cut across some of the conventional disciplinary lines that we see in the academy. So what I oftentimes say about my students, and when students come to talk to me about our program, is that for students interested in Hebrew Bible, they really do Hebrew Bible and something else. Whether that's Hebrew Bible and early Judaism, Hebrew Bible and New Testament and Christian origins, Hebrew Bible and the ancient Near East, but then also even some connections that I haven't mentioned so far. So we have some students who are especially interested in literature and art, so somebody might work across the boundaries of the Bible area and religion and literature, or the Bible area and history of religions. We have a lot of interesting connections, and we really put the onus on the student to come and think creatively about what they want to do, and then we work very hard to try to make that happen for them. The dean also mentioned that I interact a lot with our Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations. Here on campus, we actually have 2 Hebrew Bible programs that are administratively separate from each other, but really overlap significantly. So I have a set of advisees in the NELC department, Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations. I have a set of advisees here in the Divinity School as well. And these students interact all the time. And when they're in my classroom, I don't distinguish between them depending on their program. They're all expected to do the same work, and they really enrich conversation together. And I guess that leads me to talk a little bit more about my own conceptualization of myself as a scholar. I see myself as wearing maybe 3 different hats. I'm a philologist. I work on language. I'm a historian, but I'm also a literary scholar. And the combination is not necessarily 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. In any particular project, I might do more of one and less of another. But those are the 3 kind of general rubrics in which I work. Now, in terms of the way that I intersect with other areas and other faculty, I've talked a little bit about this already in the Divinity School. I thought maybe I would just give a few examples, concrete examples of the way that I've been able to interact with colleagues. I just published a book this past summer on portrayals of Moses in the Pentateuch, and I have a colleague a couple doors down who works on Islam and is especially interested, among other things, in the portrayal of Moses in the Quran. And so Michael Sells and I have the opportunity to talk, and have had the opportunity to talk at some length about both of our projects, his on portrayals of Moses in the Quran, mine in the Hebrew Bible. And it's been fascinating to see the ways that Islam picks up and reinterprets and emphasizes for some aspects of Mosaic traditions and not others. And so those have been really rich and informative interactions on that point. I've had the opportunity to team teach several courses with colleagues. one a couple years ago with Wendy Doniger on translation. And in that course, we had students who were working on a variety of different languages and literatures. Neither Wendy nor myself knew all of the languages that all of the students were working on in the class, and we saw that as a positive thing because it put the onus on the student to do more work to explain both to their colleagues, the other students in the class, and to us the nature of their projects. I'm teaching next quarter with Paul Mendesflor, who's in the History of Judaism area, a course on Jewish and Christian responses to biblical criticism. So in that course, we'll look at the rise of modern thought and the way that it has impacted the development of critical methodologies for reading the Bible. We'll look at examples both from the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament and try to think about the way that religion has responded to these critical approaches to the Bible. And then maybe a third example and a last one is this past year I co-taught with Cynthia Lintner a course on preaching the Hebrew Bible. And let me tell you, I'm not a preacher. But the students tried, they repeatedly asked, "Will you preach a sermon?" And I said no. But we had a great time in this course really thinking seriously about what it means to do critical study of the Bible and then take it a step further and put it in an applied context in the practice of preaching. And what we did was we chose 8 different texts, different genres from the Hebrew Bible, and the students had to choose from among those for their sermons. And so I had, maybe for the first time ever, I listened to, I think, 5 sermons on Leviticus. And I work on priestly texts, things like Leviticus, so this was music to my ears. But I rarely get to hear sermons on texts like Leviticus or Numbers or Deuteronomy. And we had students preaching on all of these texts. So to me, the opportunity for a really dynamic, interesting conversation across the areas and even outside of the kind of historical, descriptive, analytical work that I do has been one of the real joys of being here on the faculty.
Professor Hammerschlag.
So you might have noticed the difference between my area and everybody else's is something that Professor Rosengarten, my colleague, has recently pointed out in the paper. It's the fact that it's religion and literature, not of. And I think one of the best ways to think about what we do in the field is to think about what that means. And for me, and I'll speak for myself, that means that religion and literature does 2 things. On the one hand, it thinks about literary texts within religious contexts and how those literary texts, how the literary element of those texts can both disrupt and support the sort of communal elements of religious practice. On the other hand, it thinks about the legacy of religion in literature. So that means that people who work in religion literature sometimes work on texts that don't seem to have anything to do with religion, and sometimes they work on texts which are the Hebrew Bible or the New Testament. And I'm particularly interested in this notion of legacy, the way in which literature has to think about its textual position as a kind of legacy from religious canons. So I would say that one of the things that's also interesting about the field is that to call it religion and literature is now in some sense a little bit of a misnomer, because I would say we now have new colleagues who also work on visual media. So in some sense this religion and can also be duplicated to be thinking about religion and media, religion and film, religion and painting, religion and iconography. And in all of those cases, in some sense, that and can function the same way. You can think about the legacy in what one might call more secular forms of media, and you can think about, particularly in something like painting, the way in which religious tropes are functioning within a particular kind of medium. And in all of those cases, in some sense, one of the key questions, I think, is a question of how that actually distinguishes the area. So how does communication take place? And to what effects? And so my particular interest is also in that sense, my interest is in rhetoric, in the rhetorical effects of the way in which tropes operate. So to talk a little bit about what I do, I mean, I first think about what I do in a kind of historical sense, and I think that that's probably true of all of us. So my area of interest is bound by the fact that I work on post-war Jewish thought. And the way in which that intersects with religion and literature is that I really am interested in the kind of the survival of religious tropes in this period. So I had a project in which I talked about literally the figure of the Jew in post-war continental philosophy. And I am now, in some sense, interested, I have a project looking forward that's actually on kind of the trope of the exotic in post-war Jewish thought. So that sort of that emphasis on rhetoric means for me both the sort of the emphasis on how things are communicated, but also an emphasis on to what effect. So the kind of political consequences of this fact of legacy. So in terms of the relationship between religion and literature and the rest of the Divinity School, I mean, you heard Jeff say already that he sees himself as a literary scholar, and in fact there are a lot of, including Dean Mitchell, there are a lot of scholars here who think of themselves as literary scholars. So in some sense, one of the things that one finds when one walks around this building is that there is so much intersection between areas. I think of religion and literature as being particularly methodological as an area, which means that when a student is in religion and literature, this often means that one does and probably should have another area that interests them, whether that be defined in terms of tradition or time period or national location. That's a whole other matter. But in some sense, that the methodology has to be also it also has to coincide with the way in which that method is going to be applied, which means that by definition, we work with other areas and students who work with other areas. And so when students take exams in religion and literature, 2 of their exams are always outside religion and literature, and that means that those other 2 exams in some sense represent how they fit religion and literature into some kind of other alternative interest. But that also means that, you know, it would be very easy in some sense for us to co-teach with people in different areas. So Professor Rosengarten often teaches with people in American religion, for example, or American Christianity. Yeah, let's see. Is there anything else I want to say? I guess the other thing I would say is that one of the nice things about the Divinity School in general, but also particularly about the area of religion and literature, is that I think when I look around the university, I often see people in other departments who are doing what I would think of as religion and literature. So Eric Santner is somebody, for example, in the German department. Naama Rokem is another person in NELC. And so I think that for me, it's my sense of my place in the Divinity School is also about my place in the university. And I have quite a bit of interaction with people in those other areas, with people in Comp Lit, with people in philosophy, with people in German or French. And what I like about being in the Divinity School is that actually, rather than being in some sense cordoned off by those other disciplines, I feel like it's very easy, in some sense both geographically because of the place of this institution on campus, but also intellectually to reach out to those other areas and to coordinate with them.
I'm going to speak as a member of the faculty and from here because my colleague Dwight can. So, and also because I just didn't want to turn my back to a third of the room. I'm a literary historian of ancient Christianity, and what I mean by that is that I am interested in the very earliest glimpses that we have of Christ-believing missionary cults as they arrive on the landscape of the ancient Mediterranean world, and the earliest glimpses are textual. So I have to be a literary historian because I don't have an artifact until at the earliest, the beginning of the second, probably the first third of the 2nd century, and the earliest artifact that we have is actually a text. It's a fragment, papyrus fragment of the Gospel of John. And so to study ancient Christianity, the evidences that we want to investigate are literary. So therefore, I must be a philologist, I must know my Greek, and I must also, I think, know my Hebrew in order to understand the legacies of the scriptures of Israel, which were predominantly written in Hebrew, also Aramaic, but especially the legacies of those translated into Greek, which was essentially the Bible for the very earliest Christian authors. And so I'm a literary historian of a movement, but also of a period that is born as a period of Greek literature, but then itself becomes translated into Latin, Coptic, Syriac, all manner of other languages. So I'm really interested in the documents that are now in the New Testament, 27 book or document collection, in terms of where they came from in their original compositions. But I'm also intensely interested in the ways in which they were collected into anything like a collection that later becomes only really fully in place as a 27-book canon in the mid-4th century, and still contested, by the way, in various circles, even ecclesiastical ones today. So I'm very interested in that. But at the same time, I'm also interested in interpretation. And I argued in a book I wrote a few years ago that the very first interpreter, in some sense, of the Pauline letters is Paul himself. And that what we find in the Corinthian correspondence is Paul's continual attempt to steer and direct the meaning of the letters that he wrote to the Corinthians. And I think there are 6 such letters within the now canonical 2 letters. So you could argue the Corinthians are also some of the first Pauline interpreters, but that within the very creation of the texts is the hermeneutical question of how do we understand them? Are they clear or are they obscure? Where they're obscure, is that mystery, qua good, or is it obfuscation, qua bad? Right? How do we understand the question of textual clarity, even as the texts themselves are being produced? And that's a part of what I'm interested in. And it also means then that the act of interpretation is not just something I do on these texts, but it's within the texts themselves, both in their composition and in the history, which is a kind of spiraling echo chamber where the texts themselves become, in some sense, part of the preconditions for the interpretation of them. So it's that spiral of reception, composition, and interpretation that absolutely fascinates me. And I'm currently working in particular on a series of late 4th century Greek homilies by one author, John Chrysostom. And one of the things I love about these homilies is that he's dealing with texts that are problematic, right? And so what do you do when the religious tradition that you inherited contains within it things that appear to be self-contradictory? Like, for example, John's all worried about the fact that in Matthew 25, Jesus says you must clothe the naked and feed the hungry, but in the Sermon on the Mount, or excuse me, in the missionary discourse of chapter 10, you're not supposed to have sandals or a cloak in the first place. So John says, how can a homeless person take someone else into their home? Right? Or how can someone who has no food give food to the other? So what does he do with a scriptural legacy that faces him with problems? And those are even some of the easy ones. There are many others, both of ethical question as well as political and, of course, theological. So that's what I'm especially interested in. In terms of so in the Divinity School, I participate in 2 of the areas, in Bible and in history of Christianity. Both are in the Historical Studies in Religion Committee. I also, when I teach courses, I have students across all 4 degree programs of the Divinity School. When I teach the Introduction to the New Testament, I have MA students and MDiv students and PhD students in ethics or in history of religions or in anthropology in that class. And that's great fun. I thoroughly enjoy it. When I teach a seminar such as I did last spring on Galatians and James, Traditions in Conflict, ? around the table were MA students, MDiv students, and PhD students in 3 different areas of the Divinity School. And that's a very exciting matrix and a wonderful place to be. In terms of team teaching is really prized at the University of Chicago, both by faculty and I think also by students, and it's institutionally supported and encouraged in various ways. Just 2 or 3 quick examples. I co-taught a course with the art historian Josh Elsner, who is at Corpus Christi College, Oxford, but also visiting professor of art and religion in the Divinity School and also associated with the art history department, on Dura Europos, pagan, Jew, and Christian at Dura Europos, which is a really crucial site in eastern Syria where we have the earliest Christian house church, one of the very earliest Jewish synagogues and complete such. It's actually recreated in the National Museum in Damascus today. And also we have all kinds of cult sites from the dominant majority cultures of the Palmyrenes, the Durenes, Roman soldiers, and others. So that was one class. Another, with Professor James Robinson, we taught a course on comparative interpretation of the book of Kohelet, Ecclesiastes, between medieval Jewish commentary and early Christian commentary in Greek and in Latin. And then in 2 years' time, I will co-teach a course with 2 other colleagues, with Professor Arnold Davidson and also with Professor Stephen Collins, on asceticism in early Buddhism, early Christianity, in the light of Foucault and Pierre Hadot. So in light of technologies of the self. And I'm really looking forward to that class. And then just a last footnote is to say, as I said to you earlier today, that it takes a university to train a scholar of religion. I would say in turn that as one of the 11 chief academic officers of the University of Chicago, that in turn a university needs a very strong department or unit that is dedicated to the study of religion. That this university, as a conversation between the living and the dead about things that matter for human life, would be an incomplete conversation without people who can think and talk intelligently about religion. And one of the great things about this university is that this Divinity School is a full partner in the conversations that constitute the University of Chicago. And that's a really critical piece, I think, of our work. Last of all, I am just one other example of university collaboration. The University of Chicago sponsors a theater that's called the Court Theater. I'm on the faculty advisory board of the Court Theater, and I've been engaged in a partnership with 2 playwrights, Dennis O'Hare and Lisa Peterson, who are writing a play called The Good Book, which will premiere on March the 19th at Court Theater in a world premiere. And it has as one of its central characters, the Good Book, the Bible that emerges in a decalogue of 10 scenes that go from a wandering shepherd with a potsherd up to 1985, when the New Revised Standard Version translation was being hammered out at Princeton Theological Seminary in Princeton, New Jersey. And that's been a very exciting collaboration for me with 2 working artists who are interested in creating a work of art that engages issues of critical biblical scholarship, of biblical history, and the intersection of modern persons in that dynamic history. So it represents, in a way, my scholarly interests in a dynamic way, but it's their play and not mine, and I'm an academic creative consultant to it. So this is just one example among many of the reaches that the Divinity School has as an intellectual partner in the work of this university, and then also we hope to much broader audiences such as will experience the Court Theater production. So I want to thank all the colleagues for these stimulating comments, and John, I think we have 10, 15, bravo. So we have about 15 minutes for comments, questions. Reactions? That's a good That's a good reaction. Thank you. The International Sign Language. Oh, yes, Brian.
I was just going to question the professor of Hebrew Bible how he could require the students to give sermons, but he himself would not deliver them.
This is, I think, a very appropriate question, and one that has sort of a trite answer and one that has a serious one. So I'll go with the serious answer. So you can imagine the trite. So what I would say is that we take very seriously that we all have expertise, and we also take seriously its limits. And so in this case, I was team teaching with our Director of Ministry Studies, Cynthia Lindner. And Cynthia is a trained and erudite preacher. She knows the literature on this. She knows, she's qualified to teach preachers. And what I brought to the class was really a concern for biblical exegesis. And the thesis of the course was that the two really need to be held in tandem, right? So you all have, to the extent that you've experienced preaching, you've probably experienced preaching that doesn't follow or enact this thesis, that is not concerned primarily about doing rigorous exegesis of biblical text. There's all kinds of sermonizing that happens quite apart from that. But the thesis for this course was that we would bring these two together and try it out. So in this case, I was willing to really talk about where my expertise ended. So I was concerned especially about how the students interacted with exegetical issues in the text.
What's the trite?
The trite I shouldn't say that.
Oh, please. Yes, please.
It sounds to me like methodology is one of the big foci of what you do here. And so I guess I'm wondering how you advise students who are interested in using the type of methodology that you ascribe to, but for a different subject matter. So for example, if you were in religious literature, but not looking at, post-war thought, how would you advise
Well, that's a fair amount of what I do. For example, I'm on a committee with the dean, with a student who is working on the role of irony in the Gospel of Mark. So my experience comes in as somebody who has studied literary theory and who has worked extensively on the history of irony and modes of irony. So in that sense, I do have an area of expertise that pertains to a different historical moment. And so those kinds of intersections are often the way in which I see myself as in graduate students. I mean, I don't think I have maybe one or two students right now who actually work on post-war Jewish thought, but I have many who are interested in the history of literary criticism, for example, and its relationship to modern philosophy. Sometimes that's an interest historically in that moment, sometimes it's an interest in what it means to have a sophisticated method to deal with texts from another period.
This is a very common situation, perhaps especially at the dissertation stage, where it's not at all uncommon. In fact, it's probably the norm for dissertation committees to be put together with an eye towards precisely this. So I've had students who work on Chinese philosophy, about which I know next to nothing, but who count on me for helping them sharpen their philosophical questions and assess the cogency of the arguments and the success at representing the arguments for a general public. But I would insist such a student also have sinological expertise on their committee to hold them accountable to different kinds of criteria. So it's not an unusual sort of situation. And in fact, this university not only doesn't present obstacles to working across disciplinary and other boundaries, but it positively encourages it.
May I just add to that? Really, you're such a helpful question that I think we're known for careful attention to method. I mean, I remember when I was a student here, one of my friends saying, the few, the proud, the methodologists, right? But that can sound very lofty, right? And it can also seem to promise more than it can deliver. So oftentimes people will think, well, if I can just find the right method, then I can crack this nut. And method isn't like that, I think, good method, right? So method and theory for the study of religion, anyone who studies religion needs to have a basic knowledge of the history of the question of how to study religion. Because you have to place yourself within this broader discipline. But at the same time, methods within any of the subspecialties, methods are essentially ways of asking questions and ways of trying to pursue the answers to those questions according to certain criteria which are weighed by those methods. So the methods give you what Dan Arnold would say, in some sense, is warrants for coming to conclusions based upon the kind of question that you're asking. And so part of our work in the Divinity School is both to teach you to place yourself in the history study of religion, to introduce you to a range of methods, but also to get you to see what a method can do and what a method can't do, and in many ways, as crucial or more, get you to classify what kinds of questions you're asking. Because you can ask the same material question from multiple disciplinary points of view, as I think has been demonstrated beautifully on the panel. So it's learning to ask good questions and then learning to categorize or think about avenues to those questions. Learning to be methodologically supple and educated, but not thinking, just give me that hammer, and because you know the old thing, if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? But that's not the key necessarily to good scholarship. And so a part of the work of the school is continually thinking about what is good method, how does theory inform good method, and how do scholarly practices instantiate that. Please, yes.
I was wondering how many schools incorporating the voices of scholars of color, including womanist voices, Muhanisa voices, also how is that supporting students of color in the Divinity School?
Great, thank you.
Well, we're all of color, that's one of the white is a color. But in terms of constituencies that you mentioned, I teach these courses. And also, their texts are included in others. I know that Professor Kenneth has included some of his texts in his philosophy of religion, theology courses. So some of us focus on those things more specifically as courses. Professor Chris Cole.
She's there. She's here now.
I'm actually looking at you. So, yeah, Chris Cole can also be a representative of that. So, a couple things. One, there are folks who teach courses specifically on those topics, or those research interests that are specifically with the 11 areas and 3 committees. But at the same time, I would say most folk who are teaching are either open to that conversation or include some of those texts spread out throughout their course research as well as teaching. I think also Bill Schweiker. These people I know, I'm sure others could add to it. But again, as we approach these questions, this brings me to the method question, just to underscore some other issues. I think, one, we try to have folks develop their own voice methodologically, theoretically, epistemologically. That's one of the things I love about teaching at the University of Chicago School, that there's the whole thing, we don't clone people, right? We put there's this, the onus word that the professor mentioned about his relation to teaching, I think is generic or germane or universalized for how we all work with students. That it's up to you to put forth a view, to struggle for that view, to put out the norms and claims for that view to the public around. And I think that's one of the methodological attributes of who we are here in Chicago. Also, too, there may be situations where there may be some tension around different issues. Or you may have a suggestion the question that you raised. That's part of who we are as well. That you'll hear in some of the websites or University of Chicago critical interrogation of the investigation, and it's actually real. But the beauty of this is maybe the sort of the method of our character here is that we can struggle over issues with 11 areas, or 3 committees, or here across campus. And then we can go out and talk. I think that's a very healthy method in the academic study of religion. And I think that's quintessential Central Chicago. But picking up especially on the last President White's remarks, we like to talk about lots of different kinds of diversity as continuous with one another. So there's a certain sense, perspective from which I'm working on Indian Buddhist philosophy to represent diversity. Well, there's a whole complex story to why Indian philosophy should be taught in a religious studies program rather than a philosophy department. That's a complex history. Does addressing that address problems of historically underrepresented minorities in contemporary social formations? No, but it's not essentially different from those kinds of considerations either. And so I think we talk about a culture of collaborative diversity, representing methodological diversity and other kinds of diversity as well. And think about those as continuous with one another and not as sharply separate conversations.
Can I add to that? I mean, I guess for me, one of my key questions is about legacy. And when I say that I'm interested in legacy, I mean that I'm interested in the way in which certain kinds of canons have influenced present political questions and concerns. And what I think is unique about the study of religion, particularly, but also particularly about this place, insofar as this is a place where you can study all sorts of political issues, whether related to gender or race or whatnot, is that we bring to bear the history of the canon on those questions, and that allows you to think and have an historically informed approach to those questions. And that, I think, is really needed in the field and really important to what we're doing.
Maybe I'll say one thing about this as well. I'm very aware of the fact that biblical studies is historically very white and very male. And there are, I think, concrete steps to be taken to address this. One of these is that we've tried very hard in the years since I've been here to admit more really high quality women students and minority students. And we're having good success with this, which is exciting to me. It's also the case that this then impacts what happens in the classroom very positively. So I have a student who's very interested in feminist approaches to biblical studies, and she's she's preparing her exam right now, looking towards a dissertation that will be doing explicitly feminist kinds of things. One of my research interests is in disability studies, and so I've written a couple of articles that have approached the topic of disability in antiquity. And one of the real benefits of this, I think, is that it attunes us to all kinds of approaches that are less represented in the field. It attunes us to different questions and issues that has been the dominant approach, the dominant set of questions that have been asked. And so I think this is an exciting moment, at least if I speak for biblical studies, to see what is being done here in Chicago and how it's breaking outside of the conventional world.
Just say a word of interpretation. I think everything my colleagues have said is spot on and excellent. That Professor Arnold referred to collaborative diversity, and that came out of the Divinity School's engagement with itself and assessment of itself over the last 4 to 5 years, culminating in a study in 2010-12. And what we mean by collaborative diversity is articulating a commitment on behalf of the school to engage seriously the ongoing attempts to create here a community of broader representation of all of humanity in the study of religion, and to create the conditions for constructive conversation about religion. So it's not that we didn't do it ever before, or that we're only, but that it's in fact for the student of religion, it's already built into the enterprise, right? But what do we mean by collaborative diversity? What we mean is that you can't peel these 4 things apart. A diverse faculty, a diverse student body, a curriculum that reflects the diversities of world religions and those who are interested in them, and a community that fosters the contribution of each person, even as it strives to elevate the conversation among all of us. And so we do have, as a subcommittee of our academic policy committee, and have had now in its third or fourth year, a diversity committee that is seeking to think comprehensively about those four aspects of our life together. And that committee doesn't do that work. That committee makes recommendations to and for ourselves about how are we doing and how must we improve in that. And so a couple of things in that are that we have very thriving student groups. A group that they named themselves Alchemy in Color, students of color. We have a group of a women's caucus. We have an LGBTQ group called the Sacred Flame. Our diversity committee had 2 and 3 hour meetings with each of those committees to just ask, what's your experience here at the Divinity School been? And help us to see, where are we in terms of the kind of full and inclusive community that we want to be? And that dialogue didn't just end there, but we continue it every year. And so now at orientation, we have a panel that's called How to Be a Colleague, with students and faculty talking and thinking together about what is this colleagueship about, right? And because we all know there are all kinds of very paternalistic models that sound, they're sort of good, you can join us here, but the us is already determined. That doesn't make for good colleagueship when you've already got an us and a them, right? So how does that colleagueship get formed? And as Professor Simeon Chevelle said on the panel, that to the degree that we are, in some sense, a democracy or wish to be, it's a democracy that is formed in every action by every member of that community that expresses their commitment to that collaborative diversity, to be the kind of colleague who takes his place within the conversation that's the Divinity School. And so I would say, if you're a student here, you're part of that conversation. But that's an ongoing conversation. It's not one that's only here. It's a conversation in American society. It's a conversation in higher education. But we're seeking to make an institutional commitment that the students who come through the Divinity School take collegiality as a part of the professional toolkit that they will take from here. Reverend Cynthia Linder made that point very beautifully on the panel as well. And Professor Hopkins, part of what you heard just a few minutes ago was part of his contribution to that panel. So that's some of the ways in which we're thinking about the issues and the question that you raised. No simple solutions. We're not perfect. We're not fully where we want to be, but it is front and center in the dialogue here among the faculty and the students and the staff together as we try to be that more fully inclusive community, building on strength, but recognizing room to grow. That's called the hook from John. You see that? He's not saying, is it raining outside? I'd just like to say to the faculty colleagues here that how much I appreciate their careful words and how neat it was to get inside their work and their teaching. So how about a round of applause? And this is, I think, the last plenary session of this group, and so I would like to take this occasion to thank Dean Teresa Horn-Owens and America Huckabee in her office for the Dean of Students, all of these arrangements and the conceptualization of the day. And I especially want to thank John Howell, our coordinator for recruiting and admissions, who I think has been in email contact with every one of you along the way. And if you don't know John yet, he is a point person and a great resource for all of you. So I'd like to give a hand, especially to those who made this day possible. Enjoy the rest of the afternoon, and see you later.
We thank you for listening to or viewing our podcast. For more information and for other podcasts, please see our website, divinity.uchicago.edu/podcasts. Copyright, the University of Chicago Divinity School.